Well, good afternoon, everyone. As always, I'm excited to be back for another show, and I'm very excited for this week's guest. He's got a wide background in industrial real estate development and being an entrepreneur. So, we're going to jump into a number of different topics with him. And if you have questions that you want to ask as we're going through this, please feel free to put it in the chat bar, and we'll try to get to any questions that we can. But with that, let's bring on Volodya. Volodya, thank you so much for joining me on the show.
Thanks for having me, Chad.
I'm excited anytime I get an opportunity to talk industrial real estate, and particularly with you. Is I haven't had a developer on this show yet, so I think there's a number of things we can talk about on the development side, and also just being an entrepreneur. But first thing I want to just get your background on is why industrial real estate, and we could talk about the Density Development Corp. We can talk about some of the projects that you had later on. But what was it that attracted you to industrial real estate in the first place?
You see, Chad, I look at entrepreneurship in general as the main purpose of entrepreneurship is to find an inconvenience or a need or a problem to solve, and that's how you get paid. You do things that a market needs, and market decides where you're needed. If you solve those issues or those inconveniences, you tend to bring something to the market that is needed, that you get paid. So, in some ways, when you look at industrial, given the vacancy rates that we're facing today, and given the general, I would almost call it tectonic shifts that occurred in the last decade or so, I would even go further than that. I think it's of 2000, post 2008, you could see that there was that shift after the global financial crisis into now you had the Amazon effect, you had reducing the retail space, you had inflow of the population that needed to be serviced through a variety of different new e-commerce channels, and the general population growth in some of the areas, which then need to be serviced by plumbers, painters, you name it, bakeries, et cetera, et cetera. So when I look at industrial and said, why industrial? It's sort of a byproduct of what is really needed today. And then the second question would be, well, why is it needed, right? And to me, like let's take Metro Vancouver, for example. In preparation for the show, I just thought I would get a couple of statistics that could be quite useful. Industrial represents only 4%. So think about 4% of all land base is industrial, but it generates 27%, so one third of all jobs. Now, to me, that's rewarding. That's exciting. That tells me a story that I really want to pursue and go further and say, out of those jobs, half, a little over half, are truly industrial jobs, and that generates about 9 billion in taxes for the region. Right? Clearly, there is a need for it. Clearly, industrial is solving issues or problems or inconveniences for people, for young entrepreneurs, for people who've had a successful business for a while that want to locate into a bigger space, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, I love how you broke that down. And sorry, you said 4%, and this is in Metro Vancouver. 4% of all available land is allocated for industrial, but it's about a third of all the workforce. I would also guess that it contributes a significant amount of property taxes, which funds the government and all the programs there. And you start looking at all the ancillary jobs that just come from industrial's contribution to it. I agree with you completely. Is that it did seem to be a an often neglected area of the commercial real estate, or even just the real estate industry more broadly. It never seemed to get the same attention as, the skylines, the office towers, or the retail centers, or multifamily or single family homes. It was always that tucked away side of real estate. It was tucked away by design, because industrial had the stigma of being like these old factories that had noises and traffic and smells coming from it. So it almost always seemed to be tucked away. But in the last 20 years or so, it's now come into the spotlight, where we're seeing big distribution centers off the highways. Everybody's talking about supply chain issues these days. It seems to be a dinner table topic. So it is becoming a lot more prominent. How have you seen that shift in terms of identifying opportunities? And it can be from market specific, how you identify which markets you want to be pursuing, and then what type of product that you're building to satisfy the demand that you're seeing right now.
Excellent question. Uh, as far as selecting the site or selecting the market for industrial, for us, I would say it's a very simple formula. There's not a lot of complication behind it. So any industrial in any market, you can look at a couple of items that will make it a successful project. Number one is obviously the access. And the access is important for two reasons. Industrial, typically, it's a movement of goods. So you can think of it that way. So access for trucks and sort of delivery, et cetera. But it's also access for employees. It's such a big employee base that you don't want to build an industrial place where the jobs that are being created cannot be met. The individuals can't get to their job. So there needs to be an ease of getting to your workplace. And industrial has, Chad, we can break it down into sort of three big categories. You can take a big warehouse, 200,000 square feet, maybe it's a distribution center, et cetera. You can take a medium size to a larger base, so 10,000 square feet to 30,000 square feet, where you do have some manufacturing of some form occurring in there. And you can take a flex industrial, a small bay where you have mezzanine space, and somebody's treating it as their home base for their smaller business, which means that in the mezzanine space, they're acting as an office space to them, right? So that's how I look at it first. The first is, ease of access. The other part to it is, are you on a rail? Are you on an international waters? Are you close to a port, right? And how close are you to the airport? So once you look at those three factors, you can see roughly where you want to be, and you start selecting those items. The next layer down to me is looking at, and you can see it's really not very sophisticated in any way at that stage, because you're just looking at macro trends or macro forces influencing your particular site. Then you're looking at, well, if you are bringing a particular type of industrial, like small bay, which is something we've done a lot of, we want to be in a fairly densely populated area, because then the businesses that acquire our units, they're servicing that residential boom. The latest project that we're just completing, we're very close to occupancy, is called Langley Gateway. It's in Langley off of 200s. And I would say, location is the biggest differentiating factor for that site, because the individuals who are going to occupy the units will be servicing a very large residential population that's been booming in that area, right? So those are the kind of very basic things. And after that, it's your typical sort of checklist that you go through. You understand your environmental, your soils. To me, that's a costing exercise. Once you've made the decision that you're moving in the right direction, then you see, well, does that make financial sense? Can you deliver a product and create a value to the purchaser? Right?
Great point. And I want to dive into the one that you're working on in Langley a little bit more, just to get an understanding of the process, so that you identified the land, then how and you identified that it's in a dense area, so it makes sense from like a cursory standpoint. I want to dive into that, but I want to go back to one point you made at the beginning first, because I completely agree with it about access to the building. And the obvious one is access by vehicle traffic, commercial trucks or semi trucks, whatever is coming in. That's the more of an obvious one. But I've found that so many people actually neglect to take into account the second point you made there about, also you need to get your staff there and back. And one example that always comes to mind is I've talked to a number of companies that say, well, the price of land, and in Vancouver is an anomaly. You guys have some of the highest priced land in the world. But let's just say that an acre of urban land somewhere is $1 million, just to use a round number. But they say if we just go 45 minutes outside of that area, we can find land for half of the price. And while that may be true, the cost of building isn't going to be a lot different whether you're in that urban area or you're 45 minutes out. The construction costs are going to be the same. So really, you're going to save on a small input price of that development. But the risk of it is that you might not be able to have employees come. And the suburban one's an extreme example. Quite often, companies just don't take into account building a property that has public transit. So the employees that don't drive might not be able to get to the building as easily as the workforce that does drive. And the people making these decisions, for the most part, all drive. So they overlook the importance of, if they have workforce that needs to depend on that public transit, or just the ease of getting to it. It could be, do they want to have a 10 or 15-minute drive versus what would it take to have a 45-minute drive to get to your shop? So I completely agree with that. And I just wanted to emphasize that, just because I thought that was such a profound way on how you described that. And I always emphasize to people is land is just that one input into the overall development, and you have to take into account all the other things. So I guess that kind of leads me into the next point here, is so you identify a parcel of land. And so access looks good. You have the vehicle traffic. You're either near a port or a major highway, as you already mentioned. It's in an area that you like from a density standpoint. What's the next step once you've identified that land? And I fully realize that it's impossible to answer that question very shortly. So maybe we can just start walking through that process, because I don't have the development experience myself, so I'm genuinely fascinated in just asking you these questions. And I'll stop talking here because I know I'm going on a long winded
Well,
spiel here. But
if
if
you don't
anyone
mind,
does have questions too, and we're going too fast, just put it in the chat. We'll try to address any questions. But I'll stop talking. Land is identified. You want to proceed with it. What's the next step in the development process?
so if I may just take one little step back into the conversation about staffing and actually access to your property from a staff perspective, from employees' perspective, just want to add one more nugget for listeners. If you think about the balance sheet for your purchaser or for your tenant in an industrial space, and you were to be able to look at their how much assets they hold, et cetera, then you look at their income statement. You want to go through line by line to see what are the most expensive items they have. And typically, when you're looking at a purchaser or a tenant that's leasing 30,000 square feet, I'm making a really broad assumption here, so bear with me. But I'm saying typically the cost of that real estate in terms of lease rate, et cetera, that you're paying is not your top item. It's typically perhaps number three. So, right, because your number one is probably going to be your staff. Your number two is probably going to be your transportation costs, because if you're moving goods, it's going to be very expensive. So that 45-minute extra commute that you mentioned, it's spot on. It is absolutely can be a deal breaker for a lot of businesses that would be saying, look, for me to pay, and let's look at historical rates that we've seen here in Metro Vancouver for years and years and years. It's been $8, $6 to $8 per square foot rent, and it just stayed. And this year we're seeing 20. And you're saying, well, when did that happen? Did it happen over the last 5 years, 3 years? What would happen? But it started climbing. And why did it start climbing? Because there is too much demand, not enough supply. And businesses, to your point, in the right areas, they're not paying that anywhere. They're not going to go anywhere. They're not going to go 45 minutes further than they absolutely must. And then if the workforce is there for them, they look at their income statement. They're saying, no, this is line number one, number two. This one goes up a little bit. It really doesn't, it's an impact, but it's not your main driver yet. And so because of that, are we okay being flexible? Do we want to accommodate our staff? Absolutely. And that can happen, right?
Love it.
So
Yeah, I'm glad you emphasized that too, because I think, and that's the accountant side of you, I'm guessing, right? Looking at it from the balance sheet and income statement of the end user. I think that really is an important process for any developer. And you've said that now, I think in a couple different ways to really drive that home, is that look at the demand. The demand is ultimately what's going to drive an intelligent a developer's decision. Is that fair to say?
that's very fair, because you're thinking of who decides what's valuable or not. It's the market. It's the open market that decides whether what you're bringing is valuable or not, whether they're willing to pay you for it or not, right? So you need to listen to that market. And I'm almost tempted to quote Stephen Covey's book, Seven Habits, of saying, begin with the end in mind. Instead of looking from as a developer, it's very tempting to look at the property and the land and then say, well, how do I maximize the square footage in this? How do I get the best coverage? How do I get every last inch of it to become sellable? And I personally believe that's the wrong way of looking at it. I think this is how some people get into a little bit of trouble, because in a hot market, it's fine. It transacts. People will continue buying your units. But I think if there's any type of correction, people become more selective. And in those situations, it's if you had your purchaser in mind first, or your tenant in mind first, if you knew they were building for them and you had some substantial reasoning behind it, you tend to deliver a better product, right? And it could be, back to your question, is how do you do next after you identified a property, so it's in the right location, it's got the right access? Now you look at it, and you've already cleared that it probably has enough scale for your particular business to take that on. You probably have your finances all figured out and how to do that. The next question is just a due diligence process, and I think that's where it's very important to understand your costs, because land is not created equal. And so when you look at two properties, and it's often tempting, you see brochures from brokers and you can say, okay, this land transacted at, like you said, $1 million an acre. Well, that means across the street, it should also be $1 million an acre. Not necessarily. Why? Because if this particular property does not need a detention pond, and the other one happens to be in a swamp and needs a detention pond, and now your construction methods are changing, it's going to cost you more. Some areas could be on a swamp, might require piling. Some need preload. A preload can sit there for a year. You might not have access to your site, might not be able to do anything for that time frame, and it could cost you quite a bit too. So the next step for me is figuring out, as an entire team comes together, as to what is it that this land is actually worth. And I find this truly ironic that we put properties under contract and then go to work to figure out what it's worth. So, and that's to me the due diligence. So you're looking at obviously soil conditions, environmental, any type of, was there any contamination? Will it cost you a fortune to try to remediate? So you go to work, you engage all the consultants, you start drilling holes, you start trying to understand the actual property itself.
Yeah, and you're right. At the onset, those documents aren't necessarily there. Like there's not many, or not enough, maybe land sellers that would have gone and done a geotechnical, or maybe they've done a phase one environmental report. But I think there's also a big element of just how the site is prepared. Like if it's one site that's just old farmland versus a site that's already had some site work done, and perhaps it's been compacted a little bit, even where the utilities are. I'm assuming that whether utilities are on one side of the road versus the other will impact what the value you can pay, just as because there's a cost in bringing the utilities there.
100%. Utilities is a big factor too, especially if you need to bring them across the road. That might mean additional costs, additional approval process to actually get connected to it. But within Metro Vancouver, I would say most sites are fairly well serviced. So we don't really
Mhm.
face that issue today. I think it's more about the actual understanding the soil conditions and the environmental impact, and then you work from there in your typical. There's nothing really. There's surprising in it. Then you work towards understanding where the construction costs. So you'd be engaging with your general contractor, trying to understand what can you build on it. Your architect will have schematic plans, and throughout your due diligence, you really want to work your way into a solid pro forma. That's your main outcome at that point in time. So if you've made the big decision saying we're probably in the right area, moving in the right direction, does the pro forma work? And if you put in good information to the pro forma, it'll tell you what to do. It either go ahead, acquire it, or maybe go the other way, right?
I see. So there's a few questions, and we will jump to those in a sec. I just want to get you to elaborate on that a little bit more, Vladi, because I think that how you described that was had a lot of insight. And your goal when you secure a piece of land is to flush out your pro forma to determine. I loved how you said it. The pro forma is going to tell you what to do. Either you need to adjust some pricing, you need to adjust the plan that you have. What and it's again, this is probably very difficult for you to answer in a short answer, but what are those significant inputs? You described it already. So you're going to have a lot of your soft costs, like your architecture and perhaps any engineering. But what are the significant line items that go into that? And is that in an internally developed process, or do you rely heavily on external consultants as well?
So a performer will have, and ours is very sophisticated Excel document. The performer is very in depth. In our case, you can start with back a napkin, which is typical industry standard, where you just look at the site and you say per square foot, is it now 120 base building for your industrial, or is it now higher? And then you start adding or subtracting items depending on what your optional items may be. But fundamentally, it is better to actually do some of the work, understand your soils better so that you understand what type of construction method you will engage in, and then use that information in discussion with your general contractor, which from all the consultants we at Denciti bring in a GC first, because we want to understand whether what we envision. So some people ask, what is development? And in my opinion, development is, simplest way to describe it is to take something that you envision in your mind's eye, so a vision that you have, and converting that into a reality through the steps that you must do to actually build it, sell it, and then you have it, right? So from that perspective, is it buildable is a big question of it. And I wouldn't rely on the past project as your best numbers. I would go to a contractor and say, what do you think? Because then they may have some really creative ideas. We've seen how others do this. We've done it that way on the other side. And now you start connecting the dots and you start putting it together. But Chad, The challenge there is not so much finding the answers, it's finding those answers quickly enough, because your due diligence period in the hot market is fairly short. So you're sort of, you're like a little race car that comes out from a start line and then you just go, right? And so it does help if your team within your shop has enough experience and background to be able to make a lot of the decisions internally and rely on consultants, but be able to verify whether the assumptions from the consultants are, you know, what's the right word, whether they're manageable. Because sometimes the consultant may tell you, oh, it's this or that, and you've seen it differently in another way. And so you can ask them the right question and then the answer pops in the other way and you're okay. So it is a bit of a roller coaster ride for anybody who has not been through development. I like to refer to it as a roller coaster, because some people go through the roller coaster, they come out and they go, "Wee, this was great, let's do this again." And other people go, like, "Never again, I'm not touching." I was nauseous, I was scared, I don't want to do that again. So to me, that is the development process, because you start with, "Oh my God, this is the greatest site ever. This is going to be an absolute home run." So then you uncover something that just absolutely crushes it, and you're thinking, "How? Oh, so much effort wasted. Never going to make sense out of this." Then you solve that problem. You go, "Oh my God, we're back. We're good." And then you just keep going through these highs and lows. you know.
A roller coaster is a very appropriate analogy, and coincidentally, I took my family to an amusement park a week or so ago, and we did one roller coaster, and I got off of it, and I was like, Never
Nope.
again." But my kids were like, "Let's do it one more time." So that is a very appropriate analogy. So I want to talk in a minute here about like the next stage, like actually going through the development and working with the GCs and going through that whole process. I know you guys are merchant developers, so I want to talk about that as well, on your guys' exit strategy, as well as other exit strategies that are out there. But let's jump into some questions first, because I think some great ones came in. TCS, thanks for joining in. Hello, since land is so expensive and scarce in markets like Vancouver, are developments looking at multi-story industrial? Do the numbers pencil out? Great question.
Oh, what a fantastic question. It's also a hard question. And so I can tell you that every industrial developer is looking at stacked industrial as an option, right? And so the question becomes, when and how would the numbers pencil? The numbers do pencil if you have a large enough site with perhaps some support from, when you think about, I gotta take a step back. Some land is flat, and that's what you typically want to go into when you're doing your typical ground-oriented industrial. But then other lands could have some grade changes. So you have slope, right? And when you have slope, it can be working against you or working for you. So the most simple industrial, stacked industrial, can occur if there is sloping challenge where you're utilizing that to create, where you go and kind of, I'm trying to use my hands to kind of demonstrate, this is your road, it comes down, and then you go towards your project, and one goes up and one goes down. You meet in the middle and you have a 3-story industrial. So you have story number one still ground oriented, story number two still ground oriented, because you used your grade change to help you there, and then last one would be like mezzanine. So this would be the shortest, simplest way of looking at of a multi-story industrial. But that's probably not what the question here is actually referencing. Probably what we're thinking is in a bigger picture, saying, what about a true multi-story industrial? And there are a couple of challenges with that. We're talking about your truck access. So if you need to rely on your elevators, you're clogging things down. It's just not as efficient. It's not as effective. Second is the construction cost. And now most people, I hope you can appreciate that when you're doing industrial, you need to have a certain floor load to accommodate racking and any other industrial use inside. So from there, it stands to reason that when you go up, you need to increase the floor load, which typically would have been your roof already. Now you need to reinforce it. So your overall construction cost is significantly higher when you're bringing in, when you go in vertical. So at this point in time, it is just my own personal opinion, I haven't seen enough evidence to say that a true multi-story, and I'm thinking multi-story, think like, 4, 5, 6 stories type industrial is available here in Vancouver, that we have reached that peak need. I find that it's in my opinion, it's potentially it's coming. It's just a question of when, but it's not there yet. Not for me.
Yeah, I know some markets have experimented with it, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I would guess that the biggest risk with doing a multi-story industrial building is the fact that it's so new that to get accurate construction pricing is probably a challenge in itself, just because the GCs and the subcontractors aren't familiar with that process either. So I'd say there's a lot of volatility in that estimating
I,
the price.
I would almost go the other way and say that a price we may be able to still estimate, because I think it's, engineers and smart people can figure that part out. The bigger question I would have is there a market? Keep thinking of it like with the end user in mind, begin with the end in mind. Who's going to
Mm.
buy this from you? Who are the purchasers that would really enjoy that space and would really be pleased with being there? So I would imagine that traffic in and out of their units should be fairly limited. I'd imagine that one of the very few uses that I can think of is, labs where they're developing new technology or something like that. It's your new industrial use, right? It's not your industrial of, you're certainly not packaging something with very large turnover. So it's to me, the biggest risk would be who's going to occupy your space, who's going to come in and use it. I take a very simple example. Let's say you have a bakery. Do you want to be on the third floor as a bakery? Probably not. You prefer that your van rolls in, picks up your goods, delivers it to the next store, to the next, and you kind of keep rolling. So you want to have probably something more ground oriented.
Yeah, great answer, great question. If you are seeing multi-story industrial properties going up and you see a business case for it, let us know. I'd be genuinely curious to hear on that. Simon, thanks for joining in. We currently own and operate 100,000 square feet of flex industrial space with an average space size at 7,500 square feet. We're currently looking at building an additional 100,000 square feet. What would be the suggested bay size? And we
Oh,
can get some more information from Simon, Volodya, if that helps, or if you're prepared to just
where
answer that question.
where well, the first question is where you're located. Where's that space? Because it really is what type of businesses are in the vicinity. What is the market? What is the unmet need in the market? That should be the driving force behind answering that question.
Yeah, well, so let's actually go into that a bit. So because I think that there is I think you're like pulling on that thread. Oh, and he's in Ottawa.
Mhm.
So yeah, another big market. I think Ottawa's a million and change people, so probably a smaller market compared to what like a Vancouver or other major markets in the U.S. But with Ottawa, so to pull on that thread a little bit more, how do you go and find out what the best size is? Like, what would Simon need to do in this case to do some market research to identify that?
Right. So I would be talking to, first and foremost, the best source of information is going to be the brokerage community, just because they're on the front lines, they're doing that work, they're speaking to tenants, they're speaking to purchasers, and they'll understand the market. And if you speak to enough people, you will start getting a sense as to where the market is. Not only that, but most brokerages put up reports, and so the details in those reports, they're very useful to us. We tend to lean into them quite a bit. So I'll be looking at and I'll reverse this. I'm not an expert in Ottawa. I do not know that market, so I won't be able to give a definitive answer here, but I can probably walk you through how I would approach it if I was in that market and that was new. And no different than I would do it in Vancouver or literally anywhere else. So the first question is, what is the typically industrial clusters, right? So you'll see where there will be other industrial uses nearby. So what is there? And understanding that particular local market to me is the first step, because then you will notice whether the question is, do you bring in, say, 3,000 square foot small bay warehouses? If that's something that the market needs but it has not been provided, then that's exactly what you need to do. If, on the other hand, the feedback, and we've seen that in Vancouver quite a bit, where a lot of developers just went heavy into small bay industrial, and ourselves included. And in some areas it works really, really well, but in other areas it might not. So for our project in Chilliwack, for example, which is further out, Langley is very high density area, so small bay makes a lot of sense. High density in terms of residential and the amount of support that you'd be providing from small businesses to that community, versus in Chilliwack, we're right on the highway off of Lakeman Way, and it's one of those absolute kind of trophy sites, because your access is as good as it can get. It's a 10 out of 10 for industrial use, right? But because of its location, we're looking at it must have a dock. So grade loading would not be well received if that's the only product type that you provided, right? So I'd be looking at the evidence, what transacted in the last little while for what was leased. Look at the cluster, what's there, what's missing, why is it missing? Is it because there's nobody to actually use it, or is it because nobody has provided that? And that's where I would start.
Yeah, and just to add on my comments on that, I really like how you break that down from the standpoint of just identifying where the demand is, and identifying if there are any gaps in what's being provided. I think that that's a great tip. I would add on, just try to be as flexible as possible, especially at the beginning before you start doing any of the actual hard costs and start the construction. If you're doing 100,000 square feet, you might be able to market the space before you start the build as options available starting at 5,000 square feet all the way up to 100,000 square feet, because I am guessing if Ottawa's as hot as Toronto is, and if Toronto and Vancouver are anomalies in themselves in the North American industrial market, so I don't think anything's going to be that hot. But assuming that you have a good market, you might find a user out there that needs 50,000 square feet or perhaps the whole 100,000 square feet. And if you can get like a really good tenant in there, you don't have to put up the extra demise in walls, you don't have to put extra unit heaters, you don't have to put extra washrooms, all the costs that go into splitting a bay down into those smaller sizes. If you can be as flexible as possible, I think that just gives you the most options to try and market to the whole entire market, as opposed to just smaller spaces. Is that fair to say, Volodya?
100%. Oh, 100%. I'm so glad you went there, because I would say that, step one is identify what your advice is from the brokerage community, from your own analysis, et cetera. And step two, always test the assumptions, prepare to be wrong. The way to test it is to market the property. I certainly wouldn't put the shovel in the ground until I knew that there is some evidence of the fact that, yes, our assumptions are correct. And how do you get that? Interestingly enough, if you're in the right place, you might get not only the evidence, but you might actually get a lease immediately out, and you'd have a user waiting for you to complete your construction, which would be an absolute 10 out of 10 outcome. I'm a believer that it's okay to leave something on the table, but you don't need to go after every last penny, in a sense, but de-risking the project is a bigger priority than trying to maximize every last penny. So it would be my opinion that if you know your construction costs and you can get into like here we have CCDC2 fixed price contract as our go-to document, then you know what your costs are going to be at that stage. I'm more than willing to sell everything we've got or lease everything we've got at that stage, because I now know what my costs are. Even if the market is still going up, and in the future you're proven that you've left something on the table. So
Yeah, a great point. Love it. And yeah, just to add on to it as well, like in my mind, whether, and I do want to do a development at some point in the future, that is on my radar to do something. But right now, everything I've done has been existing properties. And so you're buying a property, and it either has a tenant in it or you're trying to find a tenant for it. But I think a lot of that process is the same, is that you need to identify, and I always recommend people do this process as well, is that even if you're buying a property that has existing cash flow in there, look at it first through the lens of it being vacant, because every property will go vacant at some point. Even a tenant that's been there for 30 years, at some point they're going to move on to another building. So if you identify what that property is worth vacant, and it's many of the same things that you're talking about already, Vlad, is you got to make sure that there's demand for it, that property, when it eventually does go vacant, has some demand for it. And I agree with you completely. The first thing I always do is I identify my downside risk, because I'm the same way. I can leave a little bit of money on the table and feel comfortable with that, but I don't ever want to be put in a position where I don't fully understand that downside risk. And I think how you described it is it's a light bulb moment for me, because I can see that your process to get to this stage is you're identifying what the market wants. So what do the tenants or buyers want in a property? Then you're going through the process and making sure you know all of your input costs to build that property. And then once you're in that position, like you said, you have a lot of confidence that you de-risked as much as you possibly can. So that leads to the next step, then, is that you actually start going through the physical development of it. So could you walk me through that process?
Well, your development is broken down into just a couple of chunks, but you obviously start with the design, and then if this property is zoned, whether you need to rezone it or not, that would be a question. If it is zoned, then you're working towards your permits based on the design that you're putting together. So it's the municipal process that you go through, and you get your entitlements. Once your entitlements are in, you have your permits, you work concurrently you work with a contractor to try and understand how you're going to build it, and then go for tender when you have your IFC drawings. It goes out, you get your numbers back. Hopefully by then you've had a couple of different stages of different budgets, class B or C, etc. You're not surprised by the tender. That's the goal. You should never be surprised by the tender coming back, or you maybe not. You should wait and don't go out for tender yet. But if everything's going in well at that stage, then you begin your construction. Now, construction then becomes, at least from our perspective within Denciti, Jackie, our VP construction, it takes a bit of a unique, I would say, a non-traditional approach to construction. It's very hands-on. And what does that mean is that even though we don't have an in-house construction group, but we act as owner's rep, Jackie's job would be to go on site and actually manage the challenges that you're going to face throughout this. So what do I mean by that? We've just gone through the pandemic. We've had some severe weather conditions. We've had flooding here in BC, which closed off. Coquihalla was washed out in a couple of areas. There's just there's a lot of issues that we've all faced, and yet our residential project in Nanaimo, that we had our literally ribbon cutting ceremony last week, came in on budget and on time, where even the mayor came up to thank us, and even in his speech he acknowledged, saying that that's very unusual to see that through all these conditions for that to occur. And the same thing with Langley Gateway. We're coming in again on budget and on time in spite of all these challenges that we've all faced. So the question is, well, how, right? And what is it about? And this is where, while most of the money in development, I would say, is made through the entitlement and the design process to get to your permits, that's where the vast majority of value is being created, because you took something that was raw. You now had a vision for what it wants to be, right? And you've created a plan for that vision now, and you've gotten yourself very far along that way, and it will have evidence as to why that is. It's a value add activity, so you're there. Construction then becomes almost like an insurance area, because if you've made this money, except that you still can lose it if you don't control your construction. So you have to be very careful. And so there, by being hands-on, you're managing the potential profits you've generated until you've got them. And so what does that mean? Because I know this is very theoretical. I'll give you a couple of examples of practical application. So what some of the things that Jackie did is, when there was a flood that we had in Nanaimo, he immediately authorized additional money for truckers to go around and do not stop. Just find me another way, get us to our site. And so that quick decision and saying, just go, because time matters to us. We want to be, we'll be okay, because there's general conditions. There's so many costs that are occurring whether you're doing anything or not. So you want to continue with your site. You want to stay on pace. You want to be on your time target, right? Within our industrial space, what was interesting is Jackie sometimes will reverse or change the order of events, so the sequencing of construction itself, depending on the conditions we're faced with. So if the weather is really bad and we had to plow ahead on something that didn't depend on the weather, that's great. Or if we're anticipating that maybe we're going to get into the winter and the conditions in the winter could be unpredictable, we don't know. So maybe we spend a little bit more money up front, get the walls up, put the roof on, so we now have some certainty. We can work inside now. So you have that ability to project as to what could go wrong and trying to preemptively, even if it costs you a little bit of money, but you do that preemptively, and in the end, it controls your future outcome. I'll give you another example: installation of windows. You want to install the windows. You're painting. The order of painting and window installation is important because you don't want to chip the paint that you've just had, right? So, but if the weather is horrible and you can't paint at all, right, then you wish that you had a couple of chips to repair versus the entire building to paint. So you have when the asphalt goes in, et cetera. So there's probably, hundreds and hundreds of decisions like that go into a development. But if you approach it from that creative problem solving, angle, and you are there hands-on, you can manage that process that much better. Right. So, and then to complete the full cycle, you said, with development, somewhere at that time, as I mentioned, when we have our budget, we know what it costs, we would have launched our sales. And since we're a merchant, most of our product has been for sale. and we would launch the sales, and then we would sign, purchase contracts or PSAs with our purchasers, vet them to decide who we want on our property, especially in the hot market. We can do that, so some groups might be rejected. It's no hard feelings. It's more about trying to match the users as much as humanly possible to one another, so that you live as part of this tiny little community, right? And if you can be helpful to each other, so obviously a person that's doing renovations for residential projects might need a plumber, might need a cabinet maker, et cetera, et cetera. So if you're lucky enough to be able to manage that process, that would be absolutely the best result possible. So once you've sold everything, now you just finish your construction. At the end of construction, you get your occupancy, and then you do hand over for the keys, and you're done.
So thanks for that detailed description. There's a lot of insight in there. And I know you're a proud entrepreneur as well. And I think people listening to this will realize that you've got a very sophisticated organization. That Denciti is not a man in a van. You guys are like an established developer. How does somebody like myself or anyone tuned in that wants to do a development but doesn't have that infrastructure, they don't have an office full of experts like Jackie, how would you recommend to someone that wants to be and actually there's a question that came in from Warehouse Investor, coincidentally. How does someone get started in development? Maybe you'll have to change your name to Warehouse Developer after Volodya gives us the answer on this. How does someone that doesn't have that infrastructure as you do get into it?
So I view development as a fundamentally different activity than an investor in real estate, right? So when I think about investor operator of real estate as being different than a developer, developer is it's much closer to that raw entrepreneurship where you are putting a lot at risk. Development is fundamentally a risky activity because the market decides whether what you're doing is valuable or not. If you deliver industrial space in the wrong, we were talking to the other person that asked about what to build, what size of a unit to build. So imagine your worst case scenario that you've built the wrong size of units and you didn't pre-sell them, you didn't test the market, you've made a couple of rookie mistakes, and in the end, here you are. You have this issue that is not really solvable because you now have product that cannot be moved. You will lose money. That's just the reality of it. The market gets to decide whether what you build is valuable or not. That's not your decision. It's up to the market. So development being so risky, in my opinion, requires literally two things to be a developer. Number one is experience. So you do need a team, you do need experience, you need to be able to either build it up from small scale, so you start with something manageable, something small that you can get your hands dirty, or you can go the way of Denciti, where I'm easy for me to stand here on our chat here, Chad, thank you for having me here. And, I may look like, this is our company, et cetera, but I have unbelievable partners. Gary, David, we founded this company together. So this wasn't just me standing on their shoulders. I look bigger, right? That's the reality of it. So if you want a sophisticated shop, then it's okay to be, to me, it's kind of like, can you let go of your ego and say, it doesn't really matter, what you are. What matters is what is everybody bringing to the table, right? So you need that. If you need that experience, then maybe it's okay to suppress your ego and say, no, I don't need to become an expert in construction to become a developer. What I may need instead is I may need to lean into the market and find people who can help me get there. It doesn't matter what type of entrepreneurship you do. Development is not that different from what Elon Musk is doing, right? Elon Musk is a very bright man, but I bet that he does not know how to build a rocket all by himself. Right. And so when he's doing his SpaceX, I'm imagining that there is probably an unbelievable team of experts that do that. So I think that's an important piece. The second piece in development, I said, there's only two things, in my opinion, that you need to become a developer: experience, and two, you need deep pockets because it's an expensive endeavor. Right. So you need some financial backing, and you need, if you're starting on a small scale, if you're starting on something potentially, either building a single family house potentially, or a small warehouse or something like that in a slightly more maybe potentially like a remote location, then you start with raising capital from, what is that, 3 F's, right? Friends, family, and fools, right? And as you get better, you get a next level of investors. So for us, we were very fortunate. We had the trust of groups like Nicola Wealth. Mark Hanna had faith in us on our very first project when we launched. Same thing with Tom Lang from Northland. I mean, having that having that support is not only boost to your confidence, but also it helps you create the right teams, etc. So to me, starting development company is not that different than starting any business out there. Any entrepreneur will face the exact same challenges, except that in development, you just need to accept the reality of development being so expensive that you will need access to capital that is fairly significant, and you will need the experience because development is, by definition, it is going through the municipal process requires a level of sophistication that you can't necessarily just wing it, in my opinion. And it's only getting more sophisticated, right? The political spectrum constantly changes. The council members, the elected officials will continue asking for more and more out of the developers. So how you manage or how you navigate those waters is a bit of an art and a science in it too. So having experience, I think, is a must.
Well said. And on that last point you made, with municipalities just making the process more onerous, I've heard from people in some markets that they're even having difficulty getting approval for development on industrial zoned land. That the municipality just is just changing their mandate or making it more difficult to build a warehouse, versus them envisioning some community oriented building or an amenity. Are you seeing that at all in Vancouver? I know you guys have significant land constraints. Are you coming up against any political opposition to the industrial industry?
I can break it down maybe into a different piece. I'd say there might be some opposition towards, technically speaking, self storage is considered industrial,
Mhm.
right? But it's not a well loved asset class by any municipality typically. Why? Because it doesn't produce any jobs. And I'm on the same bandwagon. You asked me at the very beginning of our chat here, why industrial? Why, and to me, it's a bit of a passion too, because I like the idea that we're doing something that is that creates jobs, because jobs in the future, and so there's manufacturing, there's jobs, and that is productivity to the economy, meaning we are doing something that later, while it exists for the lifespan of that industrial building, it will continue adding to the GDP. And right now, it's as current as it can get. We are having inflation issues, our interest rates are rising. How do you get out of this? Well, one of the ways is you increase the productivity, right? So the productivity is coming from something that we're adding like this. And so from that perspective, I don't really see a lot of opposition to industrial as from any of the political environment or this from any municipality, because it's a well loved asset class for what it brings to the community. It gives you jobs, and it helps the economy. So I think it's a very good outcome. The parts of industrial, like self storage, that are not as loved is because they don't achieve some of those things. And if you're surrounded by 40 different towers, high rise towers, and you have this industrial spot that really wants to be self storage, I would venture a guess that would be a good thing. And this is your vertical again. You go in firm vertical in your industrial, because self storage can be 6 stories high, and it's fine. But how many jobs does it create? It's mostly automated, and you kind of have your app now, and you come into your storage unit, you can unlock it, you can pay monthly, et cetera, right? Versus a full-on industrial space where somebody has an office, a couple of employees, and they're servicing the needs, like a plumbing needs or a cabinet maker or bakery, whatever.
Mhm.
So
Oh, that's a
hopefully
very
that.
good point. Yeah, no, I have a great explanation on that. There was a couple questions from Yakov. Yakov, thanks for joining in. We I had an opportunity to chat with Yakov the other day, and I always enjoy our chats. Do you use CoStar to do research? If so, have you found it useful and accurate?
I don't use CoStar, no.
So we do use CoStar, and I've got an ambivalence with CoStar. For some things, actually, I really enjoy CoStar for. The platform is world class. To do searches is awesome. They put out some great news content. The information is difficult for anybody to keep current. You can just
Mhm.
imagine how fluid the market is, especially all the things that happen off market, which aren't like publicly advertised or noteworthy. It's very difficult to just keep up to date on properties, and some people don't cooperate. There's some property owners or brokers that just don't cooperate with any data provider. So it's tough. It's not CoStar's fault as much as it's just a quirk or a nuance in the industry to try and keep on top of an ever evolving, dynamic, fluid marketplace. It's just very difficult. in my mind, CoStar does it the best, but they're also very expensive. So it comes with both. But if you don't use CoStar, what do you do? What how do you rely on getting market information and identifying sites?
So I'm fortunate enough to go through the right key broker relationships. That's for us. That's the outcome. So, and that relationship is fairly. Those relationships, there's many, are fairly deep, meaning that we can lean into. And I wouldn't be surprised if some of their data might be actually coming from CoStar to them before it hits us. But we have access to research departments, and if that relationship is a two-way street where we are cooperative, we share all the information that we have, etc. We tend to get fairly accurate pulse on the market.
Yeah, and then it goes back to a comment you reiterated a few times. You need to have a team, and the team involves all the people that you have internally, but it's also all the additional people that you rely on. No different than you have your lawyer and you have your accountant and your engineer and your architect. I think everybody plays an important and distinct role in helping you ultimately make the best decision that you can. So yeah, well said on that.
Absolutely.
So if anyone does have any questions on anything that we didn't cover, before we jump off, we will give a moment if people want to ask any more questions for you. But I want to end off just getting your outlook, your projection, your crystal ball, knowing that we all have murky crystal balls and there's so many factors that are unpredictable and impossible to account for. But what is your long-term outlook on the industrial real estate market?
I am positive. And I'm biased, so I have to be careful here. I'm biased. We're in it. I'm long-term positive, but I'll tell you why, and then you can disagree with the reasons for anybody that's for any listener the outcome is it's more about let's focus on the why. So for me, I look at industrial and what prompted industrial to become such a popular asset class in the last 10 years. I said first, reduction of retail. So bad retail has scaled down. And so even in core markets, you have retail just generally occupying much smaller footprint. What does that mean? You go into your store and it's now more of an experience than an actual purchase. So you're not going in to get your product, not necessarily. You may get your running shoes or something else, and then they order it, and then it's literally the next day it's at your house. So there's another way of transacting, but that means they need industrial space to store some of the goods, etc. The second part is flex industrial is still fairly new concept. We didn't have MES in industrial space, for the last 50 years. It's a fairly new concept, but it's fully accepted now. And what does that mean? That means we took a chunk out of the office sector, and people moved into. They wanted to be closer to where their business is actually located. So that's another factor. The next one is you have people. Population growth, and how do municipalities meet that population growth? Is they in the past we've just took industrial lands that were very close to the core or right in the core and upzoned them to residential. So we see that in Vancouver and Burnaby, where some of the areas that were fully industrial are now you see high rises there. So Brentwood would be a good example. So you kept diminishing the amount of industrial space, and yet you keep increasing the demand for industrial space. The big elephant, of course, still remains is that we've also increased, albeit marginally, the use for online shopping, where that blend between are you a retailer or are you an industrial user is kind of getting a little bit murky now, because you may have an industrial unit, but if you're supplying your customers or if you're shipping everything out of it, then you're acting like a retailer in a way. It's just that it happens to be on the internet, which is fine, right? So I look at all those factors and I'm saying we are also faced with the deglobalization that's currently occurring in some. It's not as this is such a big topic. We talk for like an hour just on that alone. So I'll try to keep it to the point that if we were working on full-on globalization post the dot-com boom, because the computer technology allowed us to synchronize in a way we were never able to synchronize before on a global scale, that you could get your little t-shirt or something for $13, you can't manufacture it here for that money. So you had that global chain working perfectly well together. In some ways, now we believe that we pushed it too far, and some services should not be global. They should still be done within the country so you can rely on them, right? Not only that, but also maybe having some inventory storage is not a bad thing, right? I mean, the whole pandemic toilet paper situation was kind of, funny, comical in a tragic way, right? But in the bigger picture, we do have that more goods are getting stored because of the fear of supply chain disruption of the future, which means there is an additional pressure on just storage for the industrial. So looking at all these factors together and how much good it produces, for as long as the economy is doing well, I imagine that businesses are being born, they'll need more industrial space, and I'm still bullish.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with everything that you said there. For all the reasons of e-commerce continuing to grow, the safety stock that companies are going to have to start incorporating to avoid stockouts. I love the point about deglobalization. I've been saying for several months now on this channel that there is not even just a return to warehousing, but I think there's a return to manufacturing that's coming back to Canada, the US, and Mexico. And I think we should get back to that idea that we should be proud that something's made in Canada, or made in US, or made in Mexico, and be proud of the fact that it's made in essentially in our backyard from a global standpoint. And if manufacturing comes back, there's a ton of areas like in that Rust Belt in the US where they've got tons of capable workers, tons of existing manufacturing facilities. It doesn't make sense to me that something like a t-shirt, like you mentioned, that is being made on the other side of the world, made in a factory in China, shipped by across China, then shipped across the ocean, then shipped across the country by rail. That doesn't make sense to me, where the only goal of that is to save a little bit of money, when we should be celebrating that some things actually like that are made in North America. So I'm with you. I'm biased, admittedly, as well, but I am long industrial. I'm very optimistic, notwithstanding any short-term aberrations. What can happen here in the next 6 months to 2 years, I have no idea what happens in that. It's impossible to predict. But all those reasons that you said is I'm still very bullish on industrial as well. Just before we wrap up, I see that Yakov had one more question. So if you've got a few minutes still, Volodya, to answer that, are you good for a couple minutes still?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Okay, so are you taking on more projects these days, given what may be coming down the pipeline in the economy? So yeah, right on
We
point.
are.
Specifically grounded
Yeah,
development.
we're taking on projects. Our philosophy may be a little bit different today than it was, say, 5 years ago, in the sense that today I ask the same to myself in my decision making. I ask the same question over and over and saying, okay, what happens if I'm wrong? Meaning, am I okay being stuck with a property that we've just bought? And if the answer is yes, then that's fantastic. Let's go buy it. Why? Because to me, real estate is. You have to remember. I know we have inflation, which means that we're now with interest hikes into recession, et cetera. So things aren't. Some things are not looking as bright as we hoped that they would, right? But in an inflationary environment, typically real estate has not been a bad thing. So holding real estate in inflation historically has not been a bad thing. So there's another way of looking at it. So I would say, yes, we'll take on. What we won't do, though, more recently, is any site that we see from brokers that's shovel ready. That scares us because I don't know how to make the numbers work. The pro forma, back to our initial discussion on pro forma, tells you what to do. The pro forma tells me don't build. Right now is not a very good time. So things are. I hope they'll moderate soon, because the majority of those issues that we're facing in terms of construction cost escalation are still coming from the supply chain disruption. So supply chain issues are causing a fairly big chunk of those cost increases. On top of regular increases, we have that. That's sort of my point. But if you take that away, maybe the performers start working again. So, but we're bullish and we're still active.
Love it. And if you're up for it, I'd love to have you back on sometime down the road just to chat further about this, because I could listen to you talk about industrial real estate all day, and I'm sure others could as well. I do want to thank everybody that joined in and asked questions. If you could give us a thumbs up on this, that would mean a lot. And Beverly was posting some of your links for LinkedIn and your website in the chat. So I'd encourage people to reach out to you and connect. And Volodya, once again, thank you so much for coming on the show. I really enjoyed that.
Thank you for having me. Thank you for listening.
Okay, thanks, Volodya.
Bye.
Okay, bye.